Someone has just compromised the administrative hierarchy of Buckingham Palace, triggering an explosive visual confrontation at a state banquet that has left Queen Camilla's aristocratic inner circle completely humiliated. The grand ballroom of Buckingham Palace was bathed in the warm, shimmering glow of over 1,000 wax candles, their light reflecting off the polished gold of the historic grand service plate. It was the absolute pinnacle of royal prestige, a state banquet hosted in honor of the visiting King and Queen of Spain. 500 elite guests, including foreign ambassadors, senior cabinet ministers, and the oldest aristocratic families of Europe, moved through the gilded hall in a sea of silk, velvet, and priceless diamonds. The soft murmur of polite conversation was punctuated by the gentle clinking of crystal glasses and the classical strains of the chamber orchestra playing from the gallery. Every detail of the evening had been planned with mathematical precision, designed to project an image of seamless, harmonious continuity. The air was thick with the scent of beeswax, expensive perfumes, and roasted meats, creating an atmosphere of sensory overload. But far away from the head table, in the dim, drafty corner of the ballroom, directly adjacent to the heavy service doors of the royal kitchens, a silent act of class-focused humiliation was being executed. Carol Middleton, the mother of the Princess of Wales, was being escorted to her designated seat. As she was led past the prominent tables where the dukes and duchesses sat, she was quietly, deliberately directed to a table positioned right next to the noisy, bustling service entrance. The clattering of heavy iron pots, the shouting of the palace chefs, and the constant rush of busy waiters created a deafening, disrespectful wall of noise. The smell of grease and cooking steam wafted through the doorway every time it swung open, a crude reminder of her status as an outsider in this world of inherited privilege. Carol stood by her chair, her face maintaining a dignified, quiet composure, though the embarrassment was unmistakable. Just a few feet away, seated at a prominent central table, a group of Camilla's closest lifelong friends, the women who defined the snobbish, old-money gentry of the British establishment, exchanged knowing, mocking glances. They whispered behind their silk fans, snickering at the commoner who had been put in her place. They believed the insult was complete. They believed they had successfully reminded the Middleton family of their humble origins. But then the heavy double doors of the grand ballroom swung open for the main royal procession, and the music of the chamber orchestra seemed to fade into a sudden collective gasp that rippled through the front rows of the assembly. Catherine, the Princess of Wales, stepped into the light of the crystal chandeliers. She did not wear any of the standard palace-loaned tiaras or necklaces from the Queen's collection. Clamped tightly around her throat, catching the light and refracting it in deep electric blue flashes, was the Spencer sapphire choker. It was Princess Diana's forbidden necklace, the magnificent, highly controversial piece of jewelry, composed of 7 rows of pearls, with a massive midnight blue sapphire at its center, a piece that had been locked in darkness since 1997. Catherine stood in the doorway, pale and thinned by her ongoing medical treatments, but her posture held the absolute, unyielding majesty of a future queen. The visual contrast between her physical vulnerability and her unyielding regal carriage was striking. Camilla's smug smile froze. The aristocratic courtiers, who had just spent the last hour whispering about commoners, suddenly found themselves staring into the glittering, dangerous eyes of Diana's living legacy. If you are new to my channel, hit subscribe right now because the Palace Communications team is working overtime to bury this story, and we are breaking down the exact document that allowed Catherine to use her mother-in-law's forbidden jewelry to completely destroy Camilla's palace conspiracy. To understand how a single piece of jewelry could rewrite a state seating chart and dismantle a palace plot in front of world leaders, you have to look past the modern gossip and understand the deeply secretive, highly legalistic architecture of the Spencer sapphire choker. The necklace was originally a magnificent wedding gift presented to Princess Diana by the Saudi royal family in 1981. It was her favorite piece, a symbol of her independence and her global popularity. But after her highly publicized turbulent divorce from Charles in 1996, the palace's jewel office attempted to reclaim the sapphires, claiming they were property of the crown. Diana's personal solicitors, however, had anticipated this move. They quietly registered the necklace under the Spencer Family Trust, an independent legal entity governed strictly by English trust law. This ensured that the private dynastic heirlooms of the Spencer family remained entirely insulated from the authority of the sovereign, the Queen's Jewel Office, or any future royal consort. It was a private family shield legally designed to protect her legacy from being absorbed by the institution that had rejected her. But the true power of the Spencer sapphire lay in a country-old royal protocol established by Queen Mary of Teck in the year 1913. Queen Mary, the grandmother of Queen Elizabeth II, was a woman obsessed with the preservation of dynastic dignity. She had watched for years as malicious courtiers and jealous consorts used the seating arrangements of state banquets to humiliate princesses and manipulate the social hierarchy of the court. To put an end to these petty palace games, Queen Mary forced the Lord Chamberlain's office to codify a private bylaw known as the seating prerogative. This ancient protocol dictates that any working princess of the blood who wears a dynastic heirloom of independent sovereign rank during an official state event is automatically granted the honorary seating prerogative. This is not a polite suggestion. It is an absolute constitutional override. It grants the princess the exclusive, unchecked authority to personally designate the seating placement of her immediate family members at the high table, completely bypassing the Lord Chamberlain's pre-approved seating chart to protect her family's safety and dignity. Camilla had spent months using her administrative office to push Catherine's mother to the back of the room, completely unaware that the sapphire around Catherine's neck gave her the absolute legal right to tear that seating chart in half. And the reason Catherine chose to execute this brutal, highly visible counter-strike was because Camilla and her aristocratic inner circle had spent weeks waging a quiet, predatory class war against the Middleton family. Since the announcement of Catherine's cancer diagnosis, Camilla's closest friends, a group of prominent duchesses who represented the old snobbish gentry, had been meeting privately at Clarence House. They whispered that the Middletons were getting too comfortable, that Carol Middleton was a commoner whose family had made their fortune selling party supplies, and that they were contaminating the royal bloodline. They argued that with Catherine temporarily out of public view, the Middletons should be put in their place to preserve the purity of the court. Camilla quietly, calculatedly approved. She wanted to remind Catherine that without her physical presence at court, her family held no real status in their world. Hours before the doors of the ballroom opened, Camilla's private secretary entered the empty hall. Acting under her direct verbal instruction, he quietly swapped the name cards at the head table. She would be too exhausted to check the final seating charts. They believed William would be too distracted by his diplomatic duties to notice a minor change in the seating arrangements. But William's private security detail, who monitored the CCTV cameras of the ballroom, recorded the entire clandestine swap. When William showed his wife the footage, the response was immediate. Catherine did not cry. She did not file a complaint with King Charles, knowing his weakness would only lead to more excuses. Instead, she stood up, walked to her private safe, and retrieved the leather box containing the Spencer sapphire choker. Camilla had drawn the battle lines, but Catherine was about to execute the response with a level of cold, surgical precision that would leave the queen consort completely defenseless. With the guest list finalized, the security perimeters locked, and 500 foreign dignitaries taking their designated seats beneath the towering gilded ceilings of Buckingham Palace, Catherine initiated her counterstrike. She did not seek a private audience with King Charles, knowing his physical exhaustion and aversion to conflict would only result in hollow promises. She did not engage in a loud public argument with Camilla's private office in the hallways. Instead, she walked directly into the Lord Chamberlain's anteroom, just moments before the royal procession was officially scheduled to begin. The anteroom was a quiet, dimly lit, highly secure space, hidden just off the main state corridors. It smelled of damp wool, heavy beeswax polish, and the cold, ancient stone of the palace walls. The only sound in the room was the heavy, rhythmic, unyielding ticking of a mahogany grandfather clock that had stood in that exact corner since the reign of King George III. The Lord Chamberlain, the senior executive palace official, personally responsible for the flawless execution of all royal protocol and state ceremonies, bowed deeply as the Princess of Wales entered. But his polite administrative smile evaporated the very second he looked up. Catherine reached into her black silk evening bag and placed a heavy parchment-bound copy of Queen Mary's 1913 decree flat on the leather-topped desk in front of him. She did not raise her voice. She did not exhibit a single ounce of anger, panic, or distress. She simply pointed her index finger to the massive midnight blue sapphire resting against her collarbone, and then tapped the century-old document formally and legally, invoking the honorary seating prerogative. Carol Middleton's name card was removed from Table 1, where she had originally been seated next to Prince William, and was moved to Table 18, the drafty, noisy table by the kitchen service doors. It was a petty, low-stakes act of social cruelty designed to humiliate Carol in front of the King and Queen of Spain, ensuring she would look like an unwanted outsider. They believed that because Catherine was recovering from chemotherapy, the Lord Chamberlain's face went completely, shockingly pale, all the color draining from his cheeks as the reality of the situation crashed over him. He was a veteran of palace administration, a man who had spent decades navigating the treacherous, invisible minefields of court politics, and he knew exactly what the 1913 bylaw meant. It was an unassailable constitutional mandate. As a princess of the blood, wearing a dynastic heirloom of independent sovereign rank, Catherine held the absolute, indisputable legal authority to override any seating chart he had spent months preparing alongside Queen Camilla. If the Lord Chamberlain refused to execute Catherine's directive, he would not just be upsetting a princess. He would be actively violating a century-old royal covenant. He would be triggering an immediate constitutional dispute that would legally halt the entire state banquet while foreign monarchs were waiting in the next room. He looked at the heavy black ink signature of Queen Mary of Teck on the bottom of the document, then looked slowly back up at Catherine. He realized in that agonizing moment that he was not just dealing with an angry daughter-in-law defending her mother. He was staring directly into the eyes of a future queen who possessed a cold, terrifying, and absolute mastery of royal law. He bowed his head, his hands actually trembling slightly as he accepted the document, pulling it toward his chest. He realized that Queen Camilla's petty administrative plot had just been completely, legally, and permanently annihilated. The seating chart, which Camilla's team believed was locked in stone and guarded by the bureaucracy of the palace, was rewritten by the Lord Chamberlain's trembling hand in a matter of 3 minutes. What followed inside the grand ballroom was a masterclass in silent, devastating visual execution. Just as the first course of the state banquet was about to be served, and the ambient noise of 500 guests filled the room, 2 senior royal footmen appeared. They were dressed in the formal immaculate scarlet and gold livery of the British state. They did not move quietly or try to blend into the background. They walked with a deliberate, heavy ceremonial pace, their polished black boots clicking sharply against the marble floor, a sound that immediately drew the eyes of every ambassador, foreign minister, and aristocrat in the room. The chamber orchestra's music seemed to fade into insignificance as the footmen bypassed the glittering head tables. They marched straight down the long center aisle, heading directly toward the drafty, noisy, entirely disrespectful corner near the swinging kitchen doors. They stopped in front of table 18. They stopped directly in front of Carol Middleton, in front of the whispering duchesses, the sneering old money gentry, and Camilla's smirking friends, who had spent the last hour treating the Middleton matriarch like an unwanted peasant. The 2 state footmen bowed deeply and reverently to Carol. They did not speak a word. They simply picked up her silver-plated name card, gently offered her a white-gloved hand, and formally escorted her away from the clattering noise, the smell of kitchen grease, and the shadows of the service entrance. They did not just move her to a marginally better table in the middle of the room. They escorted her down the entire length of the red carpet, walking her past the stunned, silent faces of the British aristocracy, and seated her directly at table 1. They placed Carol Middleton exactly between the King of Spain and Prince William. The King of Spain, completely unaware of the vicious palace politics playing out around him, but recognizing the immense, undeniable honor of the seating placement, immediately turned to greet Carol with a warm, deeply respectful smile. He engaged her in conversation as if she were a visiting head of state. The visual image of the commoner's daughter, a woman whose family had built their wealth selling party supplies, now sitting in the place of absolute highest honor next to European royalty, was broadcast live to millions of homes by the state television cameras. It was a complete, unapologetic public elevation of the Middleton family, executed flawlessly in front of the global press corps. Carol sat perfectly tall, her posture immaculate, conversing with the Spanish monarch with effortless grace, completely ignoring the stunned, suffocating silence that had fallen over the aristocratic tables behind her. But Catherine, Princess of Wales, was not finished. The true, ruthless, and terrifying part of the execution was about to be delivered directly to the conspirators who had orchestrated the insult. Under the strict, uncompromising terms of Queen Mary's 1913 protocol, any attempt by an unauthorized individual to alter the seating of a princess's immediate family member is legally classified as a direct threat to the security, integrity, and dignity of the High Table. Catherine had decided to use this punitive clause to its absolute fullest, most devastating extent. The two royal footmen, having successfully seated Carol at the head table, turned on their heels and walked with the same terrifying, measured pace toward the prominent central table. They stopped directly behind the chair of the specific Duchess who served as Camilla's closest confidant, the very woman who had bribed the clerks to swap the name cards hours earlier. The footman bowed to the Duchess, and then, in front of the entire assembly, they picked up her fine bone china plate, her silver cutlery, her crystal glasses, and her name card. With quiet, forceful politeness, they requested that she and her three aristocratic companions rise from their seats. They escorted the terrified, utterly humiliated women away from the center of the room. They led them down the long red carpet, walking them past the staring eyes of the foreign dignitaries directly to the empty, drafty seats near the kitchen service doors. They placed them exactly at table 18, the very seats they had tried to use to bury Carol Middleton. The duchesses were forced to sit down next to the clattering of the iron pots, the shouting of the palace chefs, and the heavy smell of cooking grease. Their faces burned with absolute public humiliation. They tried to hide behind their fans, but the damage was done. The entire ballroom watched the demographic purge in stunned, breathless silence. At the high table, Queen Camilla was completely trapped. She had to sit there, forced to maintain a tight, frozen, agonizing smile for the flashing media cameras, while her closest allies and her entire social power base were publicly, systematically demoted and banished to the kitchen doors in front of the entire world. She could not scream. She could not order the footmen to stop, because doing so would violate the very constitutional laws that gave her husband his throne. She was entirely paralyzed, and across the table, the massive blue sapphire around Catherine's neck glittered under the chandeliers, shining like a devastating trophy of complete, absolute victory. Every flash of the media cameras seemed to illuminate Camilla's defeat, capturing the moment the Queen Consort was completely outmaneuvered by the Princess of Wales. By the time the sun rose over London the next morning, the fallout from the state banquet had completely and permanently rewritten the power dynamics within the palace walls. The international press was filled with stunning high-definition photographs of the Princess of Wales. Her neck adorned with Princess Diana's legendary sapphire, the media hailed her return to public life as a masterpiece of royal diplomacy and visual storytelling. The mainstream media did not report on the vicious class war or the clandestine seating conspiracy because they did not know the truth. They simply praised the image of Carol Middleton seated in honor next to the Spanish king as a progressive, modern, and deeply touching step for the British monarchy. The public was absolutely thrilled to see the future Queen's family treated with such immense respect, and the romantic, historical legacy of Diana's jewelry dominated the global headlines for days. The narrative that Camilla's team had tried so hard to construct a narrative of a traditional old money court that excluded outsiders had been completely overwritten by a story of modern elegance and fierce family loyalty. But behind the towering iron gates of Buckingham Palace, the victory was cemented with administrative steel and the threat of total financial ruin. Prince William's private office did not wait for Camilla to recover from the humiliation. They did not allow her time to regroup or draft a counterattack. Before noon that same day, a highly confidential, legally binding memorandum was delivered directly by hand to Clarence House, and copies were simultaneously dispatched to the private estates of the duchesses who had been banished to the kitchen doors. It was not a polite letter. It was an institutional warning drafted and signed by Prince William's lead solicitors. The memorandum stated that a forensic security audit of the Banquet's seating chart had successfully identified the specific palace clerks and private secretaries who had participated in the clandestine name card swap. William made it explicitly, terrifyingly clear that if any future attempt was ever made to disrespect, marginalize, humiliate, or undermine any member of the Princess of Wales's family, his office would immediately launch a full public financial audit of the Crown land leases and private agricultural allowances currently held by Camilla's aristocratic friends. The British aristocracy is heavily dependent on the Crown estate. Many of these Grand Dukes and Duchesses live in massive historic homes that they do not actually own. They lease them from the Duchy of Cornwall at highly favorable subsidized rates. William, as the Duke of Cornwall, controls those leases. He was utilizing the immense billion-pound financial power of his duchy to issue a lethal threat. He promised to strip her allies of their grand estates, revoke their agricultural subsidies, and publicly expose their financial dependencies if they ever stepped out of line again. He was threatening them with total financial and social ruin. He had effectively built a legal financial ring fence around the Middleton family, making them entirely untouchable by the old guard. The aristocratic circle immediately collapsed. Terrified of losing their homes and their wealth, the duchesses abandoned Camilla's petty class war instantly. Camilla's private office was left completely silenced, their grand conspiracy crushed under the weight of an ancient protocol and the modern financial leverage of the heir to the throne. Miles away in the quiet, secure sanctuary of her private study at Adelaide Cottage, Catherine stood in front of a mirror. She gently reached behind her neck and unclasped the heavy diamond-encrusted latch of the Spencer sapphire choker. She carefully placed the midnight blue stones and the 7 rows of luminous pearls back into their faded velvet case. The room was perfectly quiet, far away from the frantic press offices, the scheming courtiers, and the glittering, deceptive lights of the palace. The gentle sound of the wind, moving through the ancient oak trees outside the window, was the only companion to her thoughts. She looked down at the necklace, running a finger lightly over the cold surface of the central sapphire. She realized, in that moment of absolute stillness, that she did not need to be born into a noble family to rule the House of Windsor. She did not need an aristocratic pedigree, and she did not need the approval of the old gentry. She had proven that with infinite patience, forensic preparation, and the untouchable legal legacy left behind by Diana, she could close the door on any attempt to usurp her position. She had protected her mother, defended her bloodline, and completely neutralized the queen consort without ever raising her voice. Camilla still wore the heavy jeweled crown of queen consort upon her head, but she now knew with a terrifying certainty that she held no real authority in the rooms where it actually mattered. The commoner's daughter had officially mastered the ruthless rules of the castle. The Spencer sapphire remained safely locked inside the biometric safe at Adelaide Cottage, waiting in the dark, and the ghost of Diana, Princess of Wales, was still writing the laws of the kingdom, using her daughter-in-law as the ultimate unbeatable instrument of her enduring legacy. Catherine closed the heavy leather box, turned the key in the safe, and walked out of the study, knowing that she had not just won a battle against the queen consort, she had claimed absolute unbreakable ownership of the future.